Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Intrigue Explained, another Diplomats Debate edition. My name is Dmitry, and with me is my co host and opponent, John Fowler. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Dmitry. Opponent. That's a new one.
It's less abusive than my normal intros, John. I'm actually normally this
I'm
is my
grateful.
chance. Normally this is my chance to just like swing a haymaker at your face when you're not expecting it.
I feel like I've got Stockholm syndrome, so I'll say thank you very much, Dmitry. I really appreciate your generosity.
It's good that you can recognize that I'm doing you a favor. Kind of feed into that Stockholm syndrome. Today's episode is a particularly one that's particularly close to our hearts. It's a slightly navel gazing one, I have to say. And it's all about whether countries still actually need a foreign service. This is something that I think, John, you wanted to talk about, but what spurred it was a new report released by the Australian government that had some pretty preeminent figures in foreign policy and public policy look at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and put out some pretty damning findings as well as making some recommendations about how it can be strengthened. And so we wanted to get into whether that was a good excuse to go. Is it time to call the whole thing off? John, do you feel like you're going to be taking the turn the building into a Starbucks position? Do you feel like you're ready to betray everyone we've ever loved?
Yeah, I'm ready to lose all my friends and make new enemies. Well, hopefully I'll be a little bit more nuanced than that. And I guess at the start of the conversation when we have it, we'll lay out some guidelines about what we are and aren't talking about. But I also want to say that the reason that I wanted to talk about this wasn't just because it's kind of in the news in Australia, but you had a great tweet thread, as you are so often want to do, about that, and it really just got me thinking about some of the issues. And I thought, well, maybe it's only interesting to us, but why don't we try and find out if it's interesting to more people?
There's something particularly soul destroying about, I work with a lot of academics, a lot of public policy figures who'd be like, as I wrote in my book, and I'll be like, well, if you scroll back through Twitter far enough, you'll find 13 linked tweets that make a salient point. Uh,
I believe I half drunk tweeted about this once. Why don't you go read that?
if you scroll far enough in my TikToks, then between some cooking videos, you'll find some thoughts I had. Yeah, I don't know if the foreign service is redundant, but I certainly am. John, you come to us, of course, from International Intrigue, fresh off your appearance on Morning Brew, fresh off
Hmm.
your co-founder heading to the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Yeah,
You
yeah, it's been a big
now,
one.
yeah, you now move in illustrious circles.
Well, let me even name drop more. I was out at in LA last week at the Milken conference, which had me rubbing shoulders with some pretty big people in finance. I mean, I say rubbing shoulders, sitting in the audience as they lectured us about the state of the world's finances. But I also went to a private screening of Bernard Henri Levy's new documentary, Slava Ukraini, and had a conversation with that unbuttoned shirt French Lothario. His documentary is interesting. I mean, he kind of did a sort of like he's spent 4 or 5 months literally on the front lines in Bakhmut and those kinds of places. It's not a particularly like well made documentary, but I don't think it's supposed to be. It's worth
Like
checking out
got
if people. Yeah, it's worth checking out if people get a chance. It's sort of very just like um, raw footage from what it's like being genuinely in the trenches on the front line. So yeah.
and I have to say, I mean, this war has been by far the most kind of directly televised. I don't know about
Mm,
other people, but because I'm obviously obsessed with this war for all sorts of reasons, you do find yourself watching something that 3 years ago I would have said this is a snuff film, and I would never in a
yeah.
million years be watching it. But here I am sitting there watching helmet cam or body cam footage of a Ukrainian soldier waging war and sort of taking
Hmm.
human lives, and you're glued to it. And it's also not it is simultaneously the most confronting thing I've ever seen, and remarkably normal now because of just this saturation of cam footage, drone footage. You see videos that are, in some ways snuff films. You are watching human beings die, and they're being set to rock music and techno.
Yeah, I think that what you're pointing at there, and not to digress too far, is just this. It's the trade off between, is it better to film these things and publish them and everyone to see the horrors of what's going on, so that we're not naive and blasé about the horrors of war, or does doing that desensitize us to the horrors of war, and in some ways not knowing and having it
Mm.
described through reports and firsthand accounts and documentaries and interviews, maybe sometimes that's more powerful. I mean, I don't know, like some of the horrors of World War One and World War Two are, you know, fairly effectively rendered through books and poetry rather than photos of dead soldiers. So I don't know. It's an interesting
Yeah.
debate.
It's a really interesting question. You could talk about it for hours, and sort of to expand on that. It's not that we're not watching 24-hour live streams either. We're getting selectively edited
Hmm.
footage of, as I was saying before, like literally set to a musical soundtrack with
Mm.
subtitles, where someone's showing you what they want to show you as well. So the question is, to what extent is it also propagandistic and showing you a side of war
Sure.
that isn't the 23-hour kind of horror, but is the
Banality.
exactly. I mean, there's so much to think about what this is doing to all of our brains, that thankfully it's not our department as foreign affairs people precisely, but there is just so much to think about there.
For sure. I agree.
To save you some time so that you can think about these big issues, the International Intrigue newsletter dumps really pertinent, really good analysis on international affairs stories right into your inbox every morning in, I think, something stop to try to pronounce long names. Uh, and it's really just a phenomenal resource that I really recommend people subscribe to. The links are at the bottom of the YouTube video if you're watching us record this live, or at the bottom of the podcast. We really do recommend it. We use it to build this podcast. Speaking of this podcast, we were off last week. Not many people know this, but I was actually busy piloting 2 drones into the Kremlin as part of a US
That's what
opt.
you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for the meddling uh, Kremlin press
Russian.
corps.
Yeah, right. I was gonna say state media.
And I mean, look, there's not too much you can say about this. This is another one of those stories, John. You've said this on episode after episode, where whenever we get into these intelligence spooky spaces, we just kind of have to accept we will probably never know who was piloting that drone.
Right. Right. I was listening to a podcast recently with Richard Dearlove, who was the ex head of UK's MI6, and he was kind of reflecting on this. I mean, for people who aren't aware, 2 drones allegedly tried to attack the Kremlin, but were blown up by Kremlin's anti-air, anti-drone defenses last week. And anyway, Richard Dearlove was kind of like, none of it really makes sense. He was like, the footage looked like it was kind of, not necessarily, accurate. He was like, it's weird to me that drones would be able to get that close to the Kremlin. He's like, piloting them from Ukraine is unthinkable, because
Impossible,
they
yeah.
were small drones, and they don't have that flight time. So they've been launched within Russia, but close enough to the Kremlin. He was like, none of it really made sense. And I think he came down on exactly what you just said, which is the idea like, we'll probably never know, but the most likely explanation was that it was a Russian kind of weird false flaggy kind of thing that they had hoped might generate some justification if they wanted to, send a missile to Ukraine's government quarter. But he was like, I have almost no confidence that that's true. I have no other ideas, basically.
Yeah, I'm sort of. I tried to do a ranking of plausible explanations for this, and sort of my one with almost no confidence was Ukrainian sympathizers or Ukrainian intelligence basically humiliating the Kremlin and sort of bringing the war home a little
Yeah,
bit. My
yeah,
two was like weird Russian nonsense. The false flag thing just doesn't make a ton of sense. It's not like
No,
they've been
none of it
holding
does.
back on firing missiles into Kiev. Like it's not they weren't waiting for an
No,
excuse.
right.
So like and they tried to kill Zelensky like 5 times in the first week of the war. So like just none of
Right.
it makes sense. It's just mostly just really funny because a
It's
drone
weird.
was able to get to like the flagpole of the Kremlin, and that's just embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't think there's much to add to it. That it's just weird and it's fun to speculate, but yeah, I don't think that
Yeah,
anyone really knows.
the my honestly my one takeaway was when that came out and the Russian immediate response was we know this is a Ukrainian slash US assassination attempt on Putin, who lives 20 kilometers away and like trying to kill Putin by taking a tiny grenade onto the roof of a gigantic building he's not in. It was like it was such a transparent lie that was nevertheless picked up by a whole bunch of useful idiots that my initial reaction was like, if you are a supporter of Russia or you have sympathy for the Russian argument, doesn't it just hurt you that they seem to have no respect for you and they're not even giving you good fodder to kind of support them with? There wasn't any attempt to come up with something credible. They were just like, oh, they're trying to kill Vova. Like, we have to stop them.
I feel like the Occam's razor explanation is just that some little Russian kid has
Yeah.
just lost his Christmas present.
Son,
and that's as simple as it gets.
Sonka, where's that drone we got you? Look, funny story.
Whoops.
You know how you said I should pay more attention to politics? Uh,
Yeah, exactly.
God. God. I mean, we're so close to the end of the world, and yet everything is poignant and sad and funny. Ah, what a time to be
Well,
alive.
these things provide some levity for you to be able to wake up the next day and analyze the actual war and the stuff that is not
Not as
amazing.
funny. Yeah. Um, so I think this is a good spot to take, as we always do, a quick look at 2 stories that we just want to put on your radar. I'm going to throw it over to John for both of them. These are stories that were in International Intrigue that are really, really important, but often not around a particular flashpoint in one case. And secondly, about parts of the world that just don't get as much press as other parts, at least here in the West. So I wanted to begin with just any kind of update you can give us on the Turkish elections.
Yeah. So I actually think this is a really important story that, it's getting picked up in the mainstream media, to be fair, but I think perhaps folks don't kind of grasp the importance of it. So on Sunday, Turkey will vote for a new president. Turkey's a really important country, probably underrated in importance.
Mm,
It's the second biggest military in NATO after the US. It is obviously a kind of bridge between Europe-ish kind of cultural values and Arabic, Syria, that kind of part of the world. Obviously, it's hedging against Russia, so it's like this real um, geopolitical linchpin in the middle of a very difficult area. Obviously, not far from Ukraine at the other end of the Black Sea. So all this kind of stuff, and it's President Erdogan has been in power for 20 odd years now, and has generally, I think, has been seen to take Turkey in a direction of illiberalism and more authoritarianism. I don't think it's fair to call him a dictator or anything like that. I mean, we're having elections on Sunday, which most folks seem to think are free-ish and fair-ish.
mhm,
But anyway, so the stakes, I guess what I'm saying is the stakes of the election are pretty big. And this election is the first time, I think, certainly since I've been cognizant of these issues, since that Erdogan is a genuine chance of not winning. He's been a huge force in Turkish politics for a generation. I think the previous elections were not even really a contest. But this time, it looks like there's a chance he'll lose. So there's a couple of updates on the opposition. There's the main opposition candidate whose name I'm honestly not even going to try to pronounce, but it begins with K and ends in Oglu, I think. But he's a strong candidate because he's kind of the leader of an opposition um, coalition, which is the first time a Turkish opposition party has managed to kind of work together with other opposition parties. And then the second thing was another viable candidate pulled out yesterday for reasons that are fairly opaque, but he had some accusations of bribery and all this kind of stuff. Bloomberg reported this morning that the markets had rallied on that news because I think they're sort of seeing the biggest. I mean, I think markets want Erdogan to go. They think Turkey needs to liberalize. They think Turkey needs a bit more stability and a little less kind of um, Erdogan-ness in Turkey. And the idea that there's one main opposition figure is better for that because it doesn't split the anti-Erdogan vote. Yeah, I guess all of this takes place against the background of Turkey's economy, which is inflation hit 80% last year, and I think is still at 50%. Cost of living is horrific. There was an earthquake earlier this year that we talked about that was killed
Mm-hmm.
50 odd thousand people that the government was really criticized for in terms of their response and potentially the corruption in building codes. So there's this general environment, I think, that a lot of disaffected people in Turkey, particularly youth and poor, and that Erdogan might actually lose. So yeah,
I think just from the market's perspective. I mean, it's not just that Turkish inflation has been high. The way that he has tried to combat that, from what I understand, is by effectively by lowering interest rates, which is the
yeah,
opposite to
either
how our own reserve banks
right.
try to fight inflation, where they tighten the money supply. He's tried to expand the money supply. He's just raised the salaries of all civil servants in Turkey by 45%, which, I mean, feels like the sort of thing you shouldn't be allowed to do 4 days before an election. Um,
Right.
but here we are. But again, probably not going to do wonders for inflation. So there is sort of an economic aspect to this and a huge geopolitical aspect to this, because how many times in the stories we've covered in the last couple of odd months has there been an Erdogan angle?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's on Ukraine, whether it's on NATO with Finland and Sweden, there's been Turkish elements to everything. Syria, it's just an opposition leader taking power could mean a fundamental shift in all sorts of parts of the domino board.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. But I think one thing that's important to always remember in these kinds of situations is that we don't really have a sense of what an opposition leader, this character would. And again, I apologize for not pronouncing his name, but I really have no idea where to start. But maybe you can have a go. You're much better with names and accents than I am. But we don't know what he'd be like, right? Like I think there's a general sense he'd be more liberal and that he's in opposition to Erdogan, so that's the assumption. But
Yeah.
who knows? I mean, I certainly don't have a deep enough background in Turkish politics to say, oh, well, if he comes in, then this will happen and this will happen. And in some sense, there is Erdogan is a lot of things, but, he's a very wily geopolitical operator and he's pretty good at playing off countries in the
Mm.
region against each other. So there could be a big shakeup if he doesn't win.
I think it's a really good place to leave it and move on to our second story. Vaguely nearby, Pakistan is
Mm,
experiencing immense civil unrest and a all relating to a corruption charges against Imran Khan, the former
mhm.
prime minister. Um, John, can you kind of talk us through what's happening there?
Yeah, so this is the ongoing saga of Imran Khan, who was the former prime minister, as you mentioned, who was booted from office last year on those corruption charges. He has vowed to return and has been kind of waging rhetorical war against the government and the army since he was booted out last year. Uh, on Tuesday, he was arrested on charges of graft by a special court in Islamabad, and then that has kicked off days of protests from his supporters in Pakistan. Fairly violent, from what I can understand. Protests, not necessarily to people, but they've been destroying buildings, burning things. Those kinds of protests. So pretty serious stuff. I think the current prime minister of Pakistan called it terrorism. So that not like polite marches in the street that they've informed the police about. The worry there is obviously well, there's a couple of contexts here. One, Pakistan's economy is literally on the brink of default. It needs an IMF bailout next month, I think it is, in
Mhm.
June or maybe July, but very, very soon. And as we know, the IMF is not going to step in and help out a country that is tearing itself apart and that can't
Yeah.
make promises about economic reforms.
Yeah.
So you have protests roiling the country. You have this brink. You're on the brink of economic collapse. Things are not good in Pakistan at all. And then the most recent update is that the Supreme Court of Pakistan just this morning, I believe, or late last night potentially, I think it might have been late last night, said that Imran Khan's Tuesday arrest was actually illegal. So they've released him, but they didn't release him because they said he can't go back to his house because that would cause more protests. So they've kept him in a guest house before he has to appear tomorrow on unrelated charges that he was always going to appear on. So, I think when it comes to Pakistan, it's kind of like God knows what's going to happen next. But if you zoom out, the forces of Imran Khan's supporters and his populist message versus the army is one that battle is not going to go away. And
Mhm.
I think it'd be a brave person to predict how it's going to play out, but it's playing out against the context of Pakistan could well collapse economically in the coming months.
And I think it's important to remember just how critical Pakistan is in the
Yeah.
region. Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan is sort of a critical linchpin in the region. They're about the only ones that can talk to the Taliban at least a little. And the relationship between Pakistani intelligence and various aspects of the Taliban has been a long running saga we
Yep.
don't have time to cover. Pakistan's relationship with India, we are talking about two nuclear armed states that
Mm-hmm.
do occasionally have literal armed border skirmishes, is probably the best word. But, we're talking about artillery shelling at times. So that is an incredibly sensitive kind of situation to manage. None of which is helped by the prospect of looming massive social unrest combined with looming economic disaster.
Yeah. And obviously don't forget my pet topic, which is China is hugely involved in Pakistan. Its biggest Belt and Road investment by far is in the Pakistani economic corridor. So they have a considerable interest in making sure Pakistan doesn't fall apart, because not only might their investments be damaged, but I think China sees Pakistan as a real ally and a route to the Arabian Gulf for them. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of different forces from the outside too that have an interest in keeping keeping a lid on things at least. But who knows?
One of these days, we're going to cover a story where it's like
I know. I'm sorry.
everything's good. There are no outside forces. There's no China angle. The US hasn't really got a foot in the door. It's just here's
We
this
have
thing
to.
that happened and it's fine.
I think we need to talk more about Bhutan and more about Costa Rica in that case.
Just Diplomats Debate best holiday locations in Costa Rica. It's the episode our audience craves.
Exactly.
Speaking of what our audience craves, we hope.
What a good segue.
What a segue. Tell you what, like the analysis takes up 3% of my mental energy with this podcast. Try to come up with neat segues as the rest.
Yeah.
Our main topic for today is, as we said at the top, do governments even need foreign services anymore? Is a foreign service a good investment? Are embassies around the world a good investment? Or are they perhaps an anachronistic relic of back when it took 5 months to send your ambassador a note by ship? Before we get into arguing, John kind of arguing that they are maybe outdated, and me trying to defend our former colleagues because I am still loyal, let's maybe establish some ground rules. John doesn't realize that on the podcast version, you can't see the faces he makes
I'm
when I
shaking
say
my head
stuff like
furiously.
that. And I will just edit out any denials to make myself look good. But let's maybe both set some ground rules just to. I'll start and then you can throw some in. So I think to narrow the scope of the debate, I think what makes sense is to talk almost exclusively about bilateral, so country to country missions and
Mhm.
diplomacy. I'd want to set aside, missions to the WTO, to the United Nations, to the International Criminal Court, those kind of things. Because while that's an interesting discussion about whether they're still useful, I don't think that's really the crux of what we're talking about. It's a separate conversation.
Hmm.
I also want to set aside the functions of embassies that are not diplomatic or diplomatic in the traditional foreign relations sense. So, officers that are consular officers that work to help you out if you get, say, if you happen to die overseas and your family wants to repatriate your remains, they're vitally important, but not really the subject of our conversation.
I think we furiously agree that consular and passport services are the indispensable, and they do great work. So we don't. There's no room for debate there.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said in the Twitter thread, wandering into consular within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, you meet the people who do the genuinely really hard, really important
And you're like,
work.
oh, you're
Uh,
busy.
you're busy, and everything you work on is so important and also occasionally horrific. I'm off to write some talking points, but really, we're both weirdly paid the same, which feels like an injustice.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. And also, we should also say that sort of both John and I, while we have critiqued the department in the past, and we try to be open and honest about areas of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade where we think that there have been shortcomings, I personally hugely enjoyed my time there. I love my colleagues. I still hold them in the highest regard, and none of this is intended as a personal attack on any individuals or even any kind of specifically the Australian department. We want to have a real conversation about foreign policy and diplomats as a concept.
Right. I mean, I think that's what separates cultures like Australia's and Europe and the US is that you can have open debates which are perhaps a little critical of things that you actually like and believe in, but want to make better. Right. And I think it's a very important thing to do. I and I would just echo all of that. I think this is a conversation meant to interrogate the purpose of what we
Mm.
do rather than the character or the work of the people who are actually doing it.
Yeah, and I think maybe to set you up and to get you ready to begin a first argument.
Begin the end of my career. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. These are an expenditure for governments, which means they are paid for by taxpayers. Taxpayers pay a decent amount, not a huge chunk of anyone's budget, but we are talking about billions of dollars in a country like Australia to maintain very expensive buildings in the centers of expensive capital cities and to staff those buildings with quite well remunerated foreign policy professionals that are supposed to deliver value. And I think if we can't make an argument for why those people are delivering value to the taxpayer and to the government, then I think it's entirely legitimate to ask why are they there. So with that, I'll
Definitely.
hand over to you. You are very much red teaming this. Why
Yeah.
should all of our former colleagues be fired?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the state of your setups. Okay, ignoring that last bit, I guess I wanted to. I guess my view comes from the idea of you alluded to it. The purpose of a diplomatic service, such as it was, or at least the model of a diplomatic service, and having physical presences around the world in buildings was developed and sort of perfected and became crucially important in an era, or at least before an era of instant communication via the
Mm,
internet. It depends how far you want to go back about diplomacy, but let's just take the 20th century. For much of the 20th century, getting a message from your government to another government, particularly if they're on the other side of the world, took many days, and you needed someone to be able to talk around those issues to inform each side what was actually going on in the country. Newspapers often weren't available around the world. It was a world where you just very much didn't know what was going on the other side of the world. And an embassy and a diplomatic service was a professional, trusted intelligence network. And I don't mean intelligence in terms of spies, but I mean intelligence as in terms of information and
mm,
analysis. So obviously the first argument is that, like, if that is the animating and motivating force behind the model that we have, but we haven't updated that model really to deal with the fact that the world has entirely changed the way it communicates, then I think, you know, prima facie, you kind of need to re-examine whether it's still fit for purpose. And we can get into that, and I don't necessarily think it is. But I'm drawing a lot on my experience as a diplomat in China. We were, you know, previously a diplomatic mission in China would interpret China to let you know what's going on, deliver messages to a government. Now, particularly when I was there in Shanghai, there is no chance that we were able to do better work than, say, the press there, or someone could read on their phones about what was going on, or a business delegation can figure out how to get there on their own. They don't need the embassy to open doors as much as they used to. Sometimes they do. There was just like all of that animating idea of like we were the interpreters and the gatekeepers of what was going on in China. That has all been broken down by the internet, really. And I used to joke. I used to say, like, what's the point of me writing a cable about Chinese monetary policy? Because Gabriel, who was the FT correspondent there and a good friend, he's going to do it much better, much quicker, and much more like authoritatively than I would. So what exactly is my purpose here? I'll leave it there for the first tranche, and you can come back at me.
I think and look, I think these are valid points. Obviously, the ability to communicate the way we are right now across continents, face to face, digitally, has changed some ability to deliver messages, and as you say, a robust, I suppose, where there is good reporting in other countries that is accessible and that speaks to your nation's interests. Maybe some of the intelligence gathering function has also potentially been supplanted by the ability to get a foreign newspaper at the touch of your fingertips in a way that you couldn't before. So I certainly think there is something to that argument, and I don't want to be dismissive of it. But I would say a couple of things. You know, you began by talking about the need to deliver messages. And I do think that it does make a difference, perhaps not in the Chinese context, where I think you and many of your colleagues were locked out of direct
Hmm.
relations with the Chinese government, but in a lot of other contexts,
It's an outlier, though, that example, really.
it is. In other contexts, the ability to deliver a message in person and to take the official message and to use your connections that you've built up through sometimes years of informal networking within the government to be able to explain where it's coming from, to be able to speak off the record, to be able to try to address concerns even before the message arrives, to preempt it in ways that you probably couldn't through a formal Zoom call. This kind of function of being on the ground and building those relations, I think it does still matter as the lubricant to what can otherwise be easily misinterpreted messages. I'd also say, and I'll let you respond to that point in a sec. I do think it was interesting. You know, you talked about your friend Gabrielle at the FT writes an article about Chinese monetary policy, and it goes into the FT, and maybe it's picked up. But don't you think there is a value to having someone on the ground who can monitor, whose job it is to monitor all of those sources, including those in the local language, and to be translating that information into the interests of the home country and the home government?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll take that point. I think we don't have enough time to kind of really drill down on what we're talking about here. But I think what I'm talking about is this diplomatic function of like as an information provider. I mean, you remember this. A lot of the cables come across the systems, both classified and unclassified, were things that you know you could really have read in a newspaper. I mean, there was a lot
Mm.
of stuff that you sit there and go, okay, we're being paid X number of thousands of dollars to take a couple of newspaper articles, synthesize them, maybe have a conversation with a local academic, and kind of put that in a cable. And I guess my point about the FT was, I don't think the value add over what you get in the FT. And perhaps there are certain issues in which you really want to be able to go and talk to a contact about the specific Australian angle on that. But I don't think the value add justifies the cost of having people there. And I don't think that I think with the internet, you can ask those questions of those experts without having to be in the country, specifically using resources. Now, I think, to be clear, I don't want to. My argument isn't that we shouldn't have diplomatic services. Of course, my argument is more just that we haven't rethought from the ground up how they operate, what they should look like, what they're, the model really. And you make points about having contacts on the ground, understanding the local culture, building relationships so that when you have to deliver a difficult message or you have to kind of try and influence thinking, you're there and you can do it much, much more effectively. All of that is true. But I would say a couple of things. One, you don't need an embassy of hundreds of people to do that. You need a couple, let's be very generous and say half a dozen to a dozen experts on the ground who are there for longer than a couple of years too, because this is the other thing about the diplomatic service is just as it's a famous thing across every diplomatic service, as they say, you spend your first year going, what the hell am I doing? The second year going, oh, I think maybe I can figure this out. And your third year going, I might be getting the hang of this. And then you're done. You lose all your contacts and you move on. So what I'm saying is I think the model is broken, is that perhaps we could have a tenth the size of the kind of diplomatic policy officers overseas, leave them in place for longer, make them more senior or more politically empowered so they can actually get things done rather than having to write talking points and memos for the people who do things, and get rid of the informational side of things. Because again, in places like, I mean, China's my example, but even in places like in Europe, how much value add are you adding by reporting on Czech politics when Czech newspapers do a much better job of it and Google translates a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that last point, there's a question of really the distinction there isn't how much are you doing that's more than the Czech newspapers. The question is, why do you need to be in the Czech Republic to report on Czech newspapers? Because of course the issue is that nobody in capital is reading Czech newspapers, so
Okay,
you are being
take
paid to
France
read.
then.
Okay, I don't think there are that many people in most capitals that are reading Le Monde every day. So
No,
it is useful to have somebody whose job it is to
but you hope the people who need to read French politics are, or at least, paying attention. I guess my point is I hope the people in Canberra or DC or wherever it is aren't going, well, my job is French politics back in capital, but I'll wait until the report comes in from the diplomats rather than kind of have an understanding of the French news ecosystem myself.
again, and I don't think you'd necessarily dispute this. This is, as you say, an argument for how can diplomats abroad generate more value in ways that aren't easily replicable with a Google search. And
Yeah,
just listen, and just intuitively, I mean, it genuinely, we both know it does help to be on the ground. It does help to meet people face to face where you're able to do so. It does help to be able to have quiet conversations over coffee to find out who's a legitimate actor and who isn't, which isn't something you necessarily get from Politico
for
Czechoslovakia.
sure.
Uh,
So okay, well, let me put a different angle to it. Okay, I accept all of that. So why wouldn't we then, as a country or as a government, outsource, let's say, 80% of what we do on that front? Not all of it, because some of it is classified, some of it is sensitive, some of it is difficult, but outsource it to a global consulting firm that can kind of work on your behalf, but you is going to be a lot cheaper than standing up embassies with security and posting diplomats back and forth. 80% of the stuff that you're talking about, like understanding who's legit and who's not and who we should talk to when we send our ministers there, surely most of that could be done by if not a newspaper. Take your point, there's on the ground stuff, but like, why couldn't McKinsey do that stuff?
well, I think
And I'm not holding you a softball because of your love of McKinsey there.
well, I mean, it'd be great if McKinsey did something. I would finally understand what McKinsey does if that's what they were doing. That'd be great. I think that the counter argument to that is, firstly, I'm not 1,000% sure it would be cheaper. Big blue chip consultancies are not a cheap
But they're not
exercise
$1 billion a year,
to
which is kind of
cover
what
to
DFAT's
cut
budget is.
to cover 70 countries, or the percentage of DFAT's budget, which is bilateral reporting, is not 1 billion. To cover 70 countries plus,
That's
I
fair.
think McKinsey would charge you a pretty penny. But even setting that question aside, setting the question of cost aside, I do think that, at least in my experience, you do gain a level of access by being able to say you are from the
Government.
Australian embassy and you are a representative of the government. You speak for the government, especially as an ambassador, but even as a lowly third secretary. That a McKinsey kind of information gathering MBA would not necessarily be able to open those same doors. So perhaps there is some level of information you wouldn't be able to get, some level of representation you wouldn't be able to make. So there is that kind of countering. It's also, I think, and our department wasn't always the best at this. I'm sure no department's perfected it. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade speaks civil service, and the cables are written in a language that is designed to gel with ministerial priorities. It's designed to kind of address the things that the civil service is interested in. McKinsey, as a private sector consultancy, doesn't necessarily speak that parlance, doesn't necessarily have that same kind of cultural background, and by the way, isn't bound by the civil service code, and doesn't have top security clearance in a lot of cases. So there would be practical and compositional barriers to simply outsourcing that information gathering. But, and I want to put to you something that was in my thread and that I think resonated, unfortunately, with a lot of people, is the idea that perhaps we're looking at the supply side of this equation. Is it possible that the real issue is more on the demand side? Which is that unless you are one of the Czech Republic's neighbors, there just didn't doesn't always seem to be a lot of demand for the kind of high quality intelligence that embassies could gather if they really leaned into it beyond what's in Politico.
Wait, so when you say demand side, you mean demand from other departments within government for the kinds of information that the Foreign Service can get? Is that what you're talking about?
Other departments, and most specifically from the government itself.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think that's definitely a problem. But I think it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Like it is, do they not have the demand because they've, over the last 15, 20, 30 years, been like, I don't really know why I'd read a cable, which you mentioned the language cables are written in is like speaking civil service. I think one of my, and I've been fairly open about this, but one of the things I criticize DFAT most for is the way they communicate. I think DFAT's communication style has lost its internal power within government, and I think
Mm.
it makes it uninterpretable what they're trying to say. For example, cables are anachronistic. No one reads like that anymore. No one communicates like that anymore. So is that the cause of the lowering demand within government? Like the idea maybe people would eat up a TLDR kind of here's what's going on in Czech politics and why you should give a f about it, or is it because no one cares about it that DFAT hasn't had to change its kind of approach to that stuff? I mean, there's no real answer to that, but I think you're hitting on exactly what I was going to put to you, which is how do we justify spending? I accept it's not $1 billion on the
Mm.
policy side of DFAT abroad, but a considerable sum of taxpayer dollars on compiling these reports that you have said are value additive over what people can get for $150 subscription, if there's no demand for it. How surely that tells you that the model is broken and that we need to either cut costs massively to align it with the lower demand within government, or change the model and say it's time for us to increase that demand by showing people we can be value additive back at home. And I mean, I think it's no secret that DFAT has really lost a lot of its domestic uh, argumentative power within government as a department, right? Like, I don't think that anyone sees Australia's foreign policy as being dictated and driven by DFAT anymore. It's defense and other departments that are winning that battle. I don't like only for me. the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and not getting results. Surely, if DFAT's in this position, it needs to go back and examine why we are putting people overseas if there's no demand for their work.
Yeah, I think there's a how are you doing it, and there is a is it worth doing, and I think those two are worth separating. I think on the question of why are you doing it, the question is can we imagine the kind of information or the kind of representation that might be occurring at a post in, and in Australia we often use the example of Europe. So you think about smaller countries in Europe in which Australia has an embassy. And yes, okay, there is a consular function there and there's a passports function there. There are a lot of Australian expats
Just say
in.
it. You mean Portugal?
How
I'm
dare
kidding.
you, sir? How dare you?
Beautiful place.
But we just opened an embassy in Switzerland.
Right.
Previously, Australia covered Switzerland from Berlin. And now, I think a little while ago, we have opened an embassy in Switzerland. And on the one hand, I completely understand why it is legitimate for the average Australian taxpayer to say, why am I funding a very generous, uh, cost of living adjusted ambassador's salary in Bern? When what does that deliver for me? I think I understand where that logic comes from, but my question is, can we imagine a way that that person could be useful, that embassy could be useful to policymaking? I mean, Switzerland is one of the largest banking centers in the world. It's one of the largest commodity trading and shipping hubs in the world. It is the home of international diplomacy. Like, are there are are there useful things that embassy could be doing? Setting aside the question of whether historically or in recent history DFAT has or hasn't been effective in utilizing that embassy to shape Australian policy.
I mean, yeah. I mean, when you frame it like that, it's like, oh yeah, okay, it makes sense. But I would just argue that, you know, in countries like Switzerland, it's not a bad example. Like most of our, I mean, leaving aside all the multilateral stuff,
Yeah,
which I think we agree is useful, but the bilateral relationship there is surely 99% of our interests are business interests. So wouldn't we be better off actually focusing on having better relations with our domestic businesses and our people who are, the Australian companies? I don't know, Glencore is probably a company that has a huge presence in Australia and is a Swiss company. Like, why wouldn't we be talking to the executives there and getting their perspective on Swiss policy, Swiss, is it because we're saying, oh, well, we can't trust anything Glencore says because they're a company and we need our own people in there because it's unbiased? I mean, the idea that like only an ambassador could unlock the secrets of Switzerland for the Australian government seems not real to me, and the value of having someone there probably doesn't justify their salary. But again, I'm not talking about getting rid of diplomats. Like, that's a silly thing to say. Like, for example, in the Pacific, where we actually influence policy and we can have a conversation with the prime minister of Tonga and they might come and say, how have you managed this problem in Australia? And we can give them actual advice and actual capabilities. You know, we should have a huge embassy there. I get that. But to your point, in Europe and probably in some places in, you know, well, no, Europe's probably the best
mm.
example. I just can't comprehend the value other than it being a nice posting and therefore impossible to get rid of unless you want a mutiny of diplomats. Uh, why we would spend the money we do to get the information we do when there's no demand for it, and what little demand there would be for it can be replicated externally.
Yeah, I think let's let's focus, as you've done there, on posts that are at the Venn diagram intersection of not in your country's immediate backyard, perhaps not as well wired and covered by sort of reputable news sources as others are. If I want to read what's happening in US politics, I probably don't necessarily need the cables. There are a billion sources. Maybe not so much what is happening in Tongan politics. So there's kind of that as
For
well.
sure.
And so let's indeed focus on countries in Europe where the question is like, okay, it's wealthy, it's well connected to the internet, you can Zoom call whenever you want, and you can read their papers, and there is lots of good, reputable, independent media to tell you what is going on in their country, and you could pick up the phone and call a think tanker in that country
Sure.
if you really want to. So is there still a value add? I think one thing that makes me say maybe there is this idea that even if there isn't necessarily a huge return on investment day to day, I saw what happened in Ukraine during the MH17 task force, where we suddenly, a plane with over 100 Australians was shot down over Ukraine, an incredibly complex situation. And
Mm.
suddenly we had a massive diplomatic challenge on our hands, but we had no embassy in the country. And we had we covered it from Warsaw with an ambassador who would visit once a year, who I think did as good a job as you could possibly do, but we had no presence. And we threw resources at it, and we threw generalists at it. But and this might get me in trouble. At some point, we were trying to get a bill passed that would allow a status of forces agreement for
Yeah, I
Australian
remember that.
presence there. And at some point, somebody who will go nameless, but who was incredibly senior, turned to me and went, "This just passed the Verkhovna Rada. Do we know how many houses of parliament Ukraine has? If that was the only one, like, is this a bicameral or a unicameral legis- legislature?" And genuinely, we had to Wikipedia it.
And what is it? I don't know the answer to that.
It's unicameral. There's just
There we
one.
go. So we're done.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's it. But sort of this, like, we were operating from such a profound, we knew nobody in the
Yeah.
country. We
Right.
kind of we literally almost got scammed a number of times, except our consul
Sure.
general bailed us out. So when something happens, whether it is the evacuation in Lebanon, whether it is a typhoon in the Philippines, suddenly having people who not only read the newspapers but walk the streets, and who can call government officials and on a first name basis say, "Vidik, I really need this favor." Suddenly, all of those chips that have been piling up and costing you money, you can slide across the table, and each of them
Right.
returns tenfold.
Right. No, I think that's a fair point. I would say that you're painting a very generous picture of how good diplomats on whole are at doing exactly that, and how receptive the host countries are to making those connections, right? Like Ukraine might be a good example of where they probably would have been willing to engage with us
Mm.
because we're, a relatively good faith actor and neutral. But there are plenty of places in which those relationships are not possible, and or at least a lot more difficult. And maybe that's an argument for having diplomats there even more. I don't know.
Mm.
But I think what I'm arguing here is too, because you're making great points, is that the current model is not right for it. Like, for example, if your argument of like, okay, we don't know where the next cluster thing is going to happen, so we need to maintain a diplomatic presence in as many countries as we possibly can, for that reason. Is a full blown embassy with an ambassador and all the cost and security, is that the best way to do it, or do we have representative offices where we hire local staff and have one Australian based diplomat or something like that there, kind of just keeping an eye on things, keeping capacity. It's not a full blown embassy. Maybe it looks more like a consulate, but without diplomatic status, perhaps something that can be maybe an Austrade office, maybe a separate department in which you can have a hybrid situation, a government office that can be staffed by a head of agriculture if the country abroad is most important to Australia because of its agricultural relationship, or treasury, or whatever it is. Um, you know, the idea just being that you tailor your relationship with those countries to the relationship it has with Australia, and you're much more flexible and not as rigid, being like, okay, we have to embassy there run by DFAT with an ambassador, but we have a representative. Maybe it's a business person, maybe it's an honorary consul, this kind of idea.
I think the counter argument to that would be, and this is definitely self aggrandizing and sort of fairly navel gazing, so feel free to tell me to jump in a
Mm,
lake. But I do think that foreign relations is hard, and you often need a joined up, connected strategy and somebody to be thinking about the big picture. And it is useful to have a model which is effectively like tentacles heading, like Whelan spoke with the sort of Department of Foreign Affairs covering all foreign affairs, and then everybody being an actor of that department. That once you start saying, oh, instead of having somebody who works for DFAT, I'm going to have somebody who works for agriculture because the agriculture here is really important, and they'll be the sole kind of representative, and they'll be reporting to the Department of Agriculture. You do begin to you risk a fragmentation in Australian foreign and Australia's external voice, or any country's external voice, no longer singing from the same hymnal. You know, and we see this like just as an example when we do trade negotiations. We will. It is always DFAT leading, and we are religious about trying to prevent our stakeholders and our other departments from talking directly to the other side's negotiating team, because we know what our negotiating strategy is, we know what the Australian position is, and we are coordinating a single whole of government position. And we don't want some bright spark at the Department of Treasury to just kind of put things
Fine.
on the
Yeah.
table from their perspective. So
I
there's
think that
yeah.
I was gonna say, I think that's a very specific example, and I don't disagree with you there. I'm just talking about a much more flexible model where, I don't think it would be a risk if you like, we need someone on the ground in, let me just think, I don't know, uh, well, Bali's a good example.
Okay.
We have a consulate there now, do we? Or at least in Makassar nearby that deals with that kind of stuff. Do you have one consulate? I'm not in
That's a
Bali. I'm
good
not
question.
sure, but anyway, but like, why wouldn't we have a representative, like a consular person there for obvious reasons, and a tourism person there? Like, what's a DFAT's person? Like, what DFAT's job? A policy officer from DFAT's job is to report on local politics, civil society, these kinds of things, but they are not equipped to report on or deal with or understand what's going on in a lot of places where the relationship is specific and different to what DFAT officers are trained for. And what you're arguing is that it's most important that we go back to capital and kind of get that information from the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Tourism and then represent it on their behalf. I would argue that's an old way of organizing a kind of information network around the world. And I think a lot of the times DFAT's generalism is a plus, but it's also a massive minus when it comes to doing the kinds of things you're talking about, which is building relationships, like walking the walk and talking the talk. Uh, you know, I guess what I'm arguing for isn't that we shouldn't have Australian representation overseas. It's that it should look a lot different to the structure that we do it now. It should be a lot more receptive to our interests in those regions, and it should be a lot lighter and more flexible. Is what I would argue.
Yeah. So this is I guess where it almost
And sorry,
feels
just to finish that, because the fundamental nature of embassies and big foreign services, of policy officers from, entry level to ambassador, reporting on stuff going on in the country, that is the model I think is outdated, because you do not need that chunky middle of people being like, oh, this report came out, that happened, this happened. I talked to an academic about this and they say this, because that whole middle analysis and policy element of it is, I would argue, replicatable by open source stuff or engaging with a think tank in the country. And all you need in each country is probably high level political representation who are empowered to make decisions and representations and kind of speak for the government. And then the service staff, the consular people, the people who are servicing the Australian taxpayers. Beyond that, I don't think you need the diplomatic footprint that we have, which is what we're talking about.
it's interesting because I would almost reverse that and say that for a country like Australia that is able to hire pretty selectively for its Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that's able to resource it properly.
You say that, but we got in.
Yeah, I mean, people slip through the cracks. Your co-founder Helen absolutely carried me through the group portion of my interview. I would have absolutely screwed it up without her. So thank you, Helen, for creating two careers, one after the other. Uh, but no, very very seriously, I think for a country like that, actually empowering more of the staff below a senior level to speak to people, both in country and frankly in Australia, would actually probably, you were talking about DFAT having lost its voice in the Australian system. I wonder how much of that is because DFAT is incredibly stingy with who gets to have a voice in the
Yep.
in the Australian
Super
system.
risk averse.
It's incredibly risk averse about anyone below the rank of a very senior rank talking to anybody external. That waters down at post a bit, but in part that makes it a pretty steep jump. At
Hmm.
smaller posts, it's watered down because the ambassador has no option. The ambassador has two staff. He can't be in four places at once. He's got to send two staff, or she's got to send two staff somewhere. Makes sense. At bigger missions, you do potentially spend 3 years in a windowless room reading
Bureaucracy, yeah.
newspapers in a bureaucracy. So, is there an argument for saying that rather than, a more agile model is good in principle, but I fundamentally think that you could potentially generate interest in what DFAT does and interest in opportunities in the world if you set the task right, if you start building demand for it by having DFAT proselytize the value of the information it could get or the representation it could make more broadly at home, and then empowered people abroad to go and get it. So it's not that we have the wrong people abroad or in capital. It is that we are not asking them to necessarily do the right things, and we are not doing a good enough job of explaining, of finding appetite at home outside of ministerial offices that, frankly, have, at least in some governments, been pretty disinterested in what happens in 95% of the world.
Well, I think you put your finger on something there, and I think that none of this changes unless there's ministerial appetite for changing it. And I think until someone on your Twitter feed said we should build a domestic constituency
Mm.
for foreign policy, and I think that's the key, right? Until foreign policy wins and loses votes, or sorry, it loses votes if you screw it up, but wins votes if you do it well. It will never be something that is that needs to be you know balanced in its risk appetite. It'll always be something of just like keep your job as DFAT secretary, and I'm paraphrasing and obviously generalizing, but your job as DFAT secretary is don't be on the front pages for any reason.
Yeah.
Good policy should be in the back of the paper, being like, oh, we had a good meeting with the trade minister, and no one cares because it's going well. But if you're on the front page, you're doing something wrong. I guess we're running out of time, and I find obviously I'm arguing a little bit, sort of teasing out these arguments and figuring out what I believe and whatnot. But I want to end by asking you three questions that I guess hint. And my argument here too is hard because I haven't given enough thought, and I don't have a good sense of what should replace our current system.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to argue against something without being like, this is better. But these three questions, I think, kind of illustrate where I'm getting at. The first one is, let's take an ambassador having a meeting with someone senior in the Swiss government at our Swiss embassy that you posited before. How many people do you think genuinely will read that cable back in
Mm.
Canberra? Like just as an estimate, and like not just like, oh, it'll inform all these different things, but just open that cable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would, unless something in that cable were shocking or pertained to a real domestic sensitivity, or had an insight into one of the relationships that the government has historically cared about much more. So if it was about China, if the ambassador said something really interesting about China or the US or Indonesia or people smuggling,
Mhm.
I think that the odds are it would find absolutely a niche audience at best.
Like we're talking, I think probably in the tens of people to be generous. And I think you have hit on a good counterpoint there, though, that like you never know where the interesting piece of information is going to pop up. So it's worth having the Swiss ambassador talking to the Swiss government about stuff Australia cares about in China or the Pacific. So
Yeah.
that's a fair point. But okay, so let's say be generous, 100 people open that, and the embassy costs a couple of million a year to run, roughly. I have no idea, but let's just say that's not a great. And again, I'm not saying that's his only job or her only job, but like I just want to get a set. I want people to get a sense of like the cost to reward ratio that we're actually talking about, because I think most people will be surprised how few people read the information coming in from the majority of our diplomatic network. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be, um, if if I said to you in another field, this system or this model or this business model was devised in the 1500s and kind of came to prominence in the 20th century, and yet the information revolution has happened over the last 30 years, and other than kind of slowly updating computers into our offices, nothing much has changed about the core work of the system. Would you think that's a prima facie reason that we should go back to the drawing board and rethink this from first principles, even if you arrive at the same answer?
I don't necessarily. I mean, listen, I'm a tech evangelist. I think technology is generally good and worth exploring. I think the other issues that you have raised about interest, about cost, are in some ways much more pertinent. And if as a listener where you have come down is no kind of in-person connections in the countries are important and information gathering of that form is important, then the question of like, could we be doing more on Zoom? Could we be sending cables as like TikToks with like Zoomer influencers like talking
Mm,
about talking to their bestie about what's popping off in Indonesia, like all of these questions become peripheral. The fundamental question is there value to having physical official representative presence in foreign countries within diplomatically accredited
mhm.
extensions of the foreign service? So like yes, but I think it is a secondary question. And I would note that this isn't a DFAT unique thing. I don't know of any government anywhere in the world that has
No,
said, "Cool, we're gonna all of our embassies are going to be in the metaverse." Even Estonia hasn't gone that far.
no, and I think that's right. It's not just DFAT. I think I kind of agree with what you said there, um, but I think actually rethinking this from the bones up is exactly what DFAT will never do, because it's anti its own book. It would lose its own relevance if it kind of concluded that it wasn't particularly necessary or it needed to be completely redone. But I think what you're touching on there is like, yes, there is a complete value in having human beings on the ground forming relationships, but what I'm talking about is the embassy model, the diplomatic network model, the costs model. Is that the best way to do it? Now, it may well be. We may come back and go like, yeah, that is actually the best way to do it. But we're not asking the questions. And you've just talked about technology. Like, do you? Because the third question I was going to ask you is, do you think that DFAT or any foreign service could be doing a better job of its core work if it had a different mentality, a different structure, a different kind of organization? Like, we ran on Lotus Notes when I joined, which was something in the 90s. People are barely using computers, really. Like, it's Microsoft Word, and no one is empowered by technology. Doesn't that tell you also that prima facie that something's wrong with the organizational structure if we're not able to harness this incredible opening up of productivity and insight, and DFAT's still plugging away in windowless offices?
I think that last question is a broader question about most large organizations, especially ones with a huge inherent bias towards risk aversion. I think we've talked a little bit about whether you would ever be able to um, improve appetite for foreign service products, whether you could improve ministers' interest in foreign service products. I think that might be achievable. I think some improvement of DFAT processes and DFAT thinking, absolutely achievable. I think defeating civil service risk aversion will never be done, because I think that fundamental kind of question of the absolute worst thing you can do in your career is be in a Sydney Morning Herald article. Is the apps that was the one thing we were all most afraid of. And I think while
Mm,
that's true and while that culture pervades, and it will always pervade, because that is the nature of the civil service, that is
mm.
simply the way incentives are structured, and they will always be structured. I think it's not necessarily shocking or damning to me that the civil service is a slow lumbering beast. And I think that is a problem um, so far beyond the question of specifically the embassy
Not just
model
not
that
not just
it
foreign policy, yeah.
overshadows it. But I think a good place perhaps to leave it is to say that embassies, it's worth questioning the value of each individual embassy, and it's worth questioning the value of the embassy model. It's also worth keeping in mind the reasons that we use it. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and Consular Relations provides a special legal status to these buildings, and this methodology is instantly recognizable everywhere in the world. Every government on earth knows what an ambassador is and knows what a diplomat is. Whereas once you begin shaking up that model and replacing ambassadors with alternates, you suddenly start facing having to do a lot of explaining. So there is a inflexibility to the system that would also need to be overcome. But I think, John, you've raised phenomenal questions that are legitimate to ask for any taxpayer, frankly, to say that, especially outside of an emergency or in a context where information is freely available, is the Australian taxpayer getting value for money? And my answer is, in some ways, not always. And I think in some places they're not. I just think as I think you do, the issue isn't with the underlying concept. And I don't even think it's as much with the way that DFAT necessarily does it. It is a much larger problem about how foreign affairs fits in to the Australian process and the Australian thinking and where it slots in, the appetite for its product, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to sum it up. Is, not only are there questions about how we create those products, there's questions about how useful those products are and how useful they could be, and whether they could be used in more effective ways in Australian policymaking. But yeah, I think, look, I think all of this conversation is me kind of just tossing out ideas about what if. And I think in many ways that's the point. And I think that DFAT capability review and, every other foreign service does these kinds of internal navel gazing from time to time. I mean, there's a tendency to conclude that like, things are pretty good. And if we just make a couple of tweaks, everyone's happy. But other than that, I think asking the questions is actually the the whole point. And if you come back out at these kind of vague, kind of like, well, what we're doing isn't perfect, but it's actually not too bad, then maybe we're all right. I don't know.
Well, let's just find one point of convergence, and that's if you replaced every diplomat who currently spends 90% of their time, because they're at a busy post, doing visits and arranging visits with a professional publicist at 1/3 the local staff at 1/3 the salary, but who just happens to have a DFAT email address, you would probably save the Australian taxpayer a lot of money and make a lot of diplomats much, much happier. So if anyone's looking for low-hanging fruit, if anyone's looking for low-hanging fruit, just guys, professional publicists all day. They'll be better at it, I promise. And you won't have a mutiny. You'll have a parade at DFAT if you throw this. I can almost guarantee it. So that might be a good place to wrap it up and leave it. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Intrigue Explained. As always, thank you to my co-host John of International Intrigue. Thank you to all of you for listening.
And that was a great conversation. I feel like you almost convinced me that you're right in that one, which is something that I don't like to admit, but it was a great conversation.
If all of our debates focus on whether you have value, I feel like I might win a few. Otherwise, otherwise I'm in some trouble. So thank you all for listening. As always, please do send us your feedback on Twitter. Please do give the podcast a subscribe if you enjoyed it, and do recommend it to your friends and suggest us new topics. Until next time, I'm Dmitry.
And I'm John. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.